Welcome to the Law Matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This program has been created to educate, inform, and help you with law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We continue to provide the resources that will help you to decide whether you need or want to contact a lawyer. Perhaps will help you to decide that you can actually handle some issues yourself. If you do seek outside professional counsel, you'll be better prepared, and so will the professional you select. Of course, our goal, as always, is to help you to achieve the best possible results and save time and money at the same time. We want to once again welcome and thank the Bazar and Associates law firm and attorney David Bazar,
Thank you, Deb,
who continues to help us with the various issues that we tackle. Today, children, the Department of Children and Families, and court considerations with grandparents and visitations in custody. So the safety and welfare of children has been in the news across the country lately, from children being taken from their parents at our borders, to child abuse within the home, to even very recently DCYF's shortcomings and sometimes outright failings. So DCYF in Rhode Island is recently in the news with their issue about the death of a child in a home in which there were other 8 special needs children. So DCYF's charge across the country, of course, is to ensure that each child or youth is protected from harm and is the homes are investigated and child abuse isn't happening. But of course, while they're checking in the home, we've actually found in many cases, and I'm sure you've read, that there are problems in their own system, in their own home. And also, of course, at the same time, where you want to talk about the best interest of children, and at this point, it's the consideration of grandparents who at many times are willing and able to not only do much more visitation, but actually to step up and have custody. So there are many laws that are affecting all of these situations, but also there are problems confounding each. So let's begin with them. So David, there are systems in place. I even read that in Rhode Island, there is probably 8 pages of information about how DCYF works to ensure the protection of children, and yet here we are. Right. So tell us a little bit about how the system's set up and what you see. You've worked with a child's advocate, haven't you?
Well, I was involved in the committee to suggest 3 to 5 names for that position. But yes, and I've done a number of cases in court with DCYF cases, so I am familiar with the system and what they do and how they're supposed to do it. And as you mentioned, this particular instance, it was just a massive failing on so many levels, and a tragedy that did not need to happen. And, you know, sometimes things happen and there is nothing you can do or they could have done about it. But in this instance, I think there were so many red flags beforehand that should have been looked at and were either not looked at or just ignored, that it's a massive tragedy.
So when they have these policies that are in place, and apparently years before there were red flags, they called them red flags, indicators that something is wrong. The house was in disarray, or they wanted to have access to what was the 2nd floor and they were denied. So what laws are in place to, if not have DCYF, do it have help legally with DCYF to make sure that they do have the access they need when they need it? How does that work, David?
Well, in this particular case, from what I know, and I only know what I know from news, just
Yes.
like you and most
Yes.
other people,
Yes.
is the thing that stood out to me was exactly what you said, that when they went in for the, I think what was the last adoption, and so let's just go through what the system is a little bit. So this particular case, as I understand it, the home had been approved for foster care. So that means that the DCYF workers would have had to go out and look at the home early on when the first foster child was placed there and make sure everything was okay. Mm-hmm. And then they're supposed to go back while the children are in foster care and check on how things are going. And I know that there's a lot of places that children are placed and just so many social workers, but this is critical. And so in this particular case, fast forwarding it to the last time they went out there, to do the home study. So a child is placed in foster care, and then in this particular case, a foster parent wants to adopt the child. So that means the child's been through the DCYF court system to determine whether or not reunification with the parents is possible. And if it's not possible, either by agreement or through a termination of parental rights case, the child's now available for adoption to the foster parent in this case. So they have to go back out for another home study for the adoption. And you might think that maybe what was going through somebody's mind going out to do this home study is, what do I really need to do? We've been out here so many times, and it's just routine. But nothing with the placement of a child should ever be routine. And they asked to see the second floor in this case, and they were denied access to it. So to me, that's either disqualifying in and of itself. What do you mean you won't let me up there? I also read that they perhaps could have had the police come to gain access to the second floor. But in either event, without access to the second floor, which obviously there's a reason you're being denied access, I would want to know what that is before I approve the home study and allowed the adoption to go forward.
So we should point out that every state has various rules, and they vary from state to state is the point. But what you've described pretty much seems like the skeleton base of what any functioning system would have. So if there is money given to the parent or parents who are fostering, foster parents, and it's a special needs child, I suppose they get a little bit more for that because there may be some special requirements for the home, or however that is, or maybe there's special training required on the part of the parents before they take them in their home. There's one, there's two, count them. Now they're up to 8 special needs children. Is there any structure in place to check the DCYF structure, because 8 special needs children being taken into any single home with a single parent? Doesn't that sound beyond reason?
There are rules. I'm not 100% familiar with all of the rules for how many children can be placed with a single foster family, and I would imagine in this particular instance, I don't know it that well, but were there 2 foster parents and a husband and a wife? I don't think so.
Don't think so.
So it's one foster mom taking care of 8 special needs children. In how big a house, under what circumstances? Those are all things that I'm sure there are regulations for. And not knowing exactly what they are, I don't know if it violated the rules and regulations that DCYF might have in place. But this is where there's, to me, a little bit of common sense that needs to be put into the system. And it goes to the other side of the coin, where DCYF, in cases that I've seen, has been overly burdensome in allowing people to be involved in the care of children. Now I'm talking particularly about grandparents.
Yes.
And I'm familiar with a case where there were 2 grandmothers, the paternal grandmother and the maternal grandmother, and they wanted to work together to take care of the grandchildren, or at least initially grandchild, but then grandchildren of their 2 children, who were both going through the DCYF system for neglect or dependency of the children. And one of the grandmothers lived just over the line from Rhode Island in Connecticut. And they didn't want to allow her to be involved in anything.
Who didn't want
DCYF.
to? Rhode Island's DCYF.
Right.
Okay.
And she had already been cleared by Connecticut DCF for being a foster parent in Connecticut. She had gone through their whole system. She was willing to go through the system again. The other grandmother wanted her involved and wanted her help, and DCYF said, oh, no, we don't do that. Is that because you don't want to do it, or is it against your rules? And if it's against your rules, then you need to look at your rules, because Rhode Island's not that big, and a town on the border of Rhode Island and Connecticut, where you can certainly get reciprocity with Connecticut to look at whatever you need to look at, then you're cutting out a grandchild from his or her grandparent because they're a mile over the border, and they've been involved with the children from the very beginning, and it just doesn't make sense to me.
So I read that the courts are supposed to take care of whatever is in the, quote, best interest of the children, unquote. That's a wide berth, obviously. Mm-hmm. But under what circumstance could they justify that that would be in the best interest of the child to deny, which is your point, I'm sure, and what do you do about that?
So I had another case that involved a Rhode Island grandmother in a Rhode Island DCYF case. And of course, the department's position is she has no rights in this case. She's not a party to this case. She can't intervene in this case. So I filed a grandparent visitation petition, and then the court merged those two petitions, the DCYF petition and that one, or brought them under the same judge so that that could be heard. And it was a way to get some standing for that grandparent. And in that particular case, the grandparent lived in the same house with the children under the circumstances. It was a two-family house. The grandmother lived upstairs, the children and grandchildren lived downstairs, the child. Mm-hmm. And there was an issue with the child, and that grandmother was very vigilant about what was going on. When there was an issue, she was the one that called the police. For whatever reason, since she lived in the house, DCYF didn't want her involved in the care of the children, even though they were under the same roof, but it was separate houses. And even though she did all the right things, calling the police when the police needed to be called, taking the children out of a toxic environment when it was toxic, and doing everything that was right by those grandchildren, no, she was under the same roof. We're not going to consider her for the placement of the children.
So what do you do about these considerations? I mean, that's the furthest thing from consideration, and it seems so unreasonable. You said, how about common sense? You've just cited two examples that were clearly unreasonable.
Yeah, I kind of think that you don't need to necessarily think outside the box when you're trying to figure
Certainly.
out where children should be and who they should be with, but you need to at least have some freedom to think and not just follow hard and fast rules that you may have that may or may not apply to every situation.
So did you have any recourse in that first situation? Is there anything that could actually be done, even if it's a long, protracted litigation or whatever? How did that work out, David?
In the first situation with
Connecticut.
So the children eventually got the grandchild back, so they just didn't have to deal with it anymore.
Okay.
But if it came up again, then I would certainly do the same thing I did in the Rhode Island case. I'd file the grandparent visitation petition, and I'd try to get it in front of a judge so the judge can apply some independent logic and reason to the case and enforce the issue that way.
I guess it's time to back up just a moment, because in looking at this issue about grandparents, visitation, and custody, the visitation element was a bit of a surprise because it said that grandparents may apply for visitation. Wouldn't you have thought that well, this isn't a legal question when I said wouldn't you have thought that it's a foregone conclusion that grandparents, of course, have access to their grandchildren, but apparently there are procedures in place even for this, and it's on the books as law. Please explain.
Okay.
And try to justify.
Right. So there is a reason for the process and how it is designed, and just a couple of things. First of all, we might step back to years ago when it was common for multi-generational families to live under one roof.
Absolutely.
And so
Sure.
that's the way that we grew up, not me in particular, but folks, and you had
accepted norm.
Yeah, expanded families under one roof. So now we come to this situation today with grandparents and grandparent visitation and the laws. And the law in Rhode Island is that if you are the grandparent and there are certain circumstances that have occurred, you have a right to petition for visitation. And you have to petition for the visitation because it is a right that's only enforceable by the court in the best interest of the grandchildren. And so the one instance where you can petition is if your child, the mother or father of the grandchild is either deceased or out of the picture for one reason or another and hasn't had their own custody or visitation. And the theory there is that if your child was still alive, they would be facilitating the visitation and you would be getting it through that process. The other situation is when there are two parents of a child and they're not allowing a grandparent or grandparents to visit. And that one you have to show that you haven't been able to visit for, it used to be 6 months, it may be 30 days now, before you petition the court for visitation. And now it's a tougher situation because parents have a right to raise their children the way they want. And they may have a valid reason for not wanting that visitation, or they may not. And that's where the court has to step in and decide what's in the best interest of the child. And interestingly enough, and I've had a case where this has been used, and siblings have the same right now under the grandparent visitation statute to also apply for visitation with their brother or sister. And you might say, well, what's that all about?
Yes, I would say that.
Tell me how that might ever be a case. So it could be a situation, for instance, where one mom has two children and gets divorced. Well, let me say has one child, gets divorced, and has another child.
Yeah, so they're half-siblings.
Right, they're half-siblings, but under our statute, half-sibling is a sibling.
Sure.
But let's say the dad has children with two different moms, and he dies. So now the child of one of the dad's children, the other mother's not allowing to visit, and they want to visit, so they have the right to petition to determine whether it's in their both their best interests to visit. Did you follow that?
Yes, I did. So ordinarily, people don't have to go through a court system when it comes to grandparents and grandparents' visitation. Suffice it to say, it makes sense that they usually can come and go until there's some issue that's raised. You raise some of the circumstances, deceased, or I guess you didn't mention, but if you had one of the parents who had a lapse of alcoholism or in some way posed a threat, potential threat to the child, or wasn't taking good care of the child, then that might bring grandma into the situation of petitioning.
I did mention it in terms of they're absent for one reason or another.
But that's one of the reasons
So, yes.
that could do it.
Yep.
So apart from that, you'd assume that grandparents really don't have to worry about asking for visitation, but you also referred to one other term that seemed to show up here, and that is grandparent having standing. Not just by virtue of the fact that she is one of the parents' parent, she doesn't have automatic standing?
So the standing to visit your grandchild is codified in the law about grandparent visitation rights. So you have standing to bring that case. But what I was talking about was that DCYF case, where the DCYF case is between the state, the Department of Children, Youth and Families, and the parent of the children.
Okay.
Because it's the parent who have the obligation and responsibility to raise their children,
Yes.
and to do so in a manner that's safe and healthy for the child. And that's where the DCYF or the department can charge neglect or dependency or that type of thing against the parent for failing to provide adequate care and supervision of the children.
Okay. Is it safe to say that across other states something similar is in effect, maybe not actually as you stated for Rhode Island, but close to that, there's something similar in each state?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. And what I'm suggesting, encouraging, is that we look at our current laws and think about the DC, and I'm talking about DCYF cases and neglect and dependency cases.
Yes.
And there are some rules in place where there's, and you want to place a child in relative foster care, they call it. In other words, that the foster parent or parents would be relatives. That's sort of a priority and supposed to be a priority, and it is a priority in many cases. But we often cut out grandparents. And I also believe there might be an age where if you're over a certain age, the grandparent's no longer eligible to be considered. And again, I kind of think...
That's an interesting
I
thing.
think that should be on a case-by-case basis for a judge to exercise his or her discretion over after being able to talk to the grandparent and maybe bring the grandparent in, and maybe some limited ways, such as the case that I had, where the grandparent might have the opportunity to file a motion to intervene, and the judge would have the opportunity to hear that case and determine whether or not they should be allowed some standing into the DCYF case, so that you don't have to bring that separate grandparent visitation case.
And if the grandparent wanted to intervene, would it be DCYF's charge to go check out the home of the grandparent? Would that be under their purview, or
Well,
no?
if they had standing to intervene, then
Okay.
absolutely, and DCYF would be charged with looking at the home of the grandparent. Certainly, if they were being considered for the foster care relative placement, it's required, so yes.
And where and when does the child welfare advocate come into play in these situations?
So this is more of a broader picture
Yes.
that the child advocate is looking at, and how DCYF is doing its cases, not each specific case,
Yes.
but overall, what they're doing in terms of these. And we go back and forth where the state contracts with placement facilities
Yes.
outside of foster homes and does it on a large scale, versus then they retract and cancel those contracts, and the advocate oversees a lot of what they're doing and where they're contracting with and going out to see those facilities. And certainly on tragedies like we just saw, the advocate's going to get involved to look at what happened and to try to make recommendations so those things don't happen.
And apparently, while she may be fairly new in the position, right after that, somewhere around October of last year, apparently a federal report came out citing that Rhode Island and other states as well had 8 or 9 egregious, or never mind infractions, egregious situations that they were going to be following up on. So there were obviously red flags all along the way, and I'm sure that they were trying to correct some, but certainly this led to a very terrible situation.
Yeah.
With a very bad outcome, obviously.
And the child advocate said she was putting a commission together to study it, and she's done a really good job about trying to get her arms around a very difficult situation.
So we've talked a little bit about foster care, and then in some cases, well, in this one case with the bad outcome, there was actually an adoption that took place. Let's talk a little bit about grandparents beyond visitation. So visitation may be an issue, hopefully it gets settled amicably, but suppose it needs to go beyond that and the grandparents understand that they really need to step up and go further. Is it guardianship the next step? Is it custody the next step? How does that proceed, David?
So that's another area where we really need to look at the law and try to tweak it a little bit. So a guardianship of a child in Rhode Island can either be filed in probate court or in family court. In probate court, it's only when both parents agree, or there's one parent and that parent agrees to the guardianship, and oftentimes it's a relative and many, many times a grandparent, and it comes up really fairly regularly. So if there's an agreement across the board as to the placement through a guardianship, you can go in probate court. If there isn't, then it has to go to family court. And there's another area where we need to sort of tweak our jurisdiction. Right now, that guardianship can only be done through DCYF and through the DCYF calendar, and it's not a really good way of doing it. There should be a situation where a grandparent or whoever it is applying for guardianship, and that they can apply through a miscellaneous case in the family court and have it heard on the domestic, I call it the domestic calendar, like any other case of placement or custody or that type of thing is heard.
Has that always been the case? Because I guess I can recall myself that I had my grandmother become, my maternal grandmother become my guardian when my father was away and my mother wasn't always right there on scene. So there wasn't an ordeal about it. I just remember going with my father, and it was almost a perfunctory thing. It was done, easy, done.
In Rhode Island?
Yes.
In probate court?
Well, it was not very recently. That's why I asked if you
Would it have been probate court? Because it was by agreement. Rhode Island probate court still has jurisdiction to hear
see.
guardianship for someone under 18 by agreement. So there is jurisdiction for that. In fact, it's exclusive jurisdiction in probate court for a guardianship of someone over 18.
Okay. So guardianship might be the next step along the way, if not full out, I'm going to get custody of my grandchild. That would come last resort? How does that work?
I don't even know that there is a real mechanism to get
Okay.
anything beyond guardianship without the next step being an adoption. So that's one of the things I'm saying. Let's tweak the law so that there might be an opportunity in the right case, petition before the family court by a miscellaneous petition in front of the judge for placement of the child or that type of thing. Call it custody if you want.
So if the grandparent wants the guardianship and the parents oppose it, is that probate? Is that full-out family court? Never mind, it's war and whatever else.
Say it again.
So if the parents are wanting to oppose grandma's
In
taking
Rhode Island,
guardianship.
it's family court, and that's what I'm saying. And the process in family court isn't very crystal clear and easy to put in place. We should make it easier. Not that this should happen often, and not that it's a situation. And I guess part of the situation is this. It's almost like a fundamental right in some ways to be free to raise your children the way you want to raise them, as long as you're doing it in a healthy manner that's in their best interest.
Fair enough.
In fact, you could even argue that the best interest standard doesn't necessarily apply to two parents raising their children the way they want to do it, as long as it's healthy and not dangerous to the child in
Sure.
some form or fashion. We've seen cases many years ago, if you remember some of these things, about hemophiliac blood transfusions and religious objections to
objections.
some of those things, right? I'm not exactly sure what those were, but those cases where the parent had a religious belief and, well, that's not in the child's best interest. That's all right. A parent has a fundamental right to raise their children the way they want, as long as it's not neglectful or dangerous to the child, so to speak.
I hope this is fair to ask in a quick, with a quick response. Do kids have some rights too about, I don't want that transfusion, I do want that inoculation, and I don't want my parents, I want my grandparents to raise me. Do they get a vote?
Yes and no, not really. But to some degree, the older they get, the more input they might have on that. But no, it's not their decision. They're still a child.
Even if they
theoretically.
have a case where they could say,
They
Mom
can
did
file
this,
for emancipation if they're old enough.
that's the next step. Okay.
So there's some things that they can do, but in any event, so you got to weigh and balance that. So we don't want grandparents to be able to just come in willy-nilly and be able to oppose what their children are doing because they don't like the way they're raising their grandchildren. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is just where there's parents who are missing, gone, whatever, a way for the grandparents to be able to petition the court to become more involved.
Good points. Thank you. We thank you for tuning in to The Law Matters. We hope you'll continue to tune in because, of course, the law matters to you.